Okay, let's talk about falsetto. You know what? When I was teaching the 5-day course, I don't know if any of you who were on it remember, we had to call it the F word because there was always uproar. Oh God, no, it's time to do the F word. Because there was so much disagreement about what falsetto is. That's partly to do with historical viewpoints of falsetto. But, you know, I think I understand why that happened now. Okay, so now I'm going to divert into registers. Let's go there. It's a little sidestep, and I promise you, there is a point to it. Wow. Registers are reported by singers of all types. We talk about the gear change, the passaggio, the transition, the turn of the voice. And you know what? In the past, there's been massive disagreement about vocal registers. But register mechanisms, as we now call them, they're much better understood, and there's a very good agreement in the voice science community on the nature of pulse, modal, and falsetto registers. Jo always insisted that her voice qualities were independent of register mechanisms. We were not allowed to talk about registers on the course, and it's very clear from the research papers that that was something that she wasn't going to look into. And during my own Estill trainer days, I ignored registers too. And I rather think that was because I trained as a soprano and I never used my chest register anyway. But after I moved away, I began to notice that they really mattered. And it was especially obvious when I was working with female students if they wanted to take their voice quality across the range. Registers are patterns of vocal fold vibration that we make here at the sound source. So therefore, underlying every voice quality, there has to be a register mechanism. We can't escape that. There they are. Get over it. So it then began to make sense to me that the qualities, the Estill qualities of speech and cry, are both based on a modal register, what we sometimes know as M1. In fact, you can think of them on a sort of a thick fold, thin fold, but it's a continuum. Falsetto is an entirely different mechanism with a different vibratory pattern. You can see it on a stroboscope. It's got its own continuum in terms of range. In the female voice, we quite often use it in the middle range and even lower. It's not just belonging to the top of the range. I'm going to show you a visual next that I think will make sense in terms of how this fits together. This was actually put together by one of our accredited teachers who is also an Estill CMT, and he devised this so that he could explain to his students how the voice qualities fitted into the register terminology. So I'm going to focus on the idea of modal here rather than talking about the creak and the falsetto and the whistle. Okay. So I've just mentioned the word continuum, modal, thick, thin continuum. And this is what Craig came up with, and it was rather nice, slightly tweaked by me. Towards the lower part of the range, we have thicker vocal folds. We're using the shortening muscles, and it's called TA dominant. And there's always more resistance to the breath because the vocal folds are thicker. Up towards the upper part of your range, we have a thinner vocal fold. The lengthening muscles are dominant, the CT. Tilting muscles, if you like. Less resistance to the breath because the vocal folds are thinner. And then we have this whole middle region. And what he did for his students to help them cross the gear change was say, there's a handover between the cricothyroid and the TA. Find it in your voice. And this is very much in line with contemporary thinking on registers that you can read about on the National Centre for Voice website, that we have thicker TA dominant and CT dominant versions of modal, and then we have falsetto. So there are a couple of advantages to this approach that I want to tell you about. First of all, I think it frees up our thinking to create a much wider range of tonal qualities than the 6 voice qualities that are in the Estill model. In our practice, Jeremy and I teach 20 different mixes, if you like, on a modal register and 20 on a falsetto. And we have a lot of fun. We call it the mixing desk. Okay? There's another advantage. It allows for a better dialogue between the more mainstream approaches to singing teaching and the Estill model. We need it. In our practice, we find it also helps us to work with trainers from other disciplines. You know, we have Estill people on our courses, we have complete vocal technique people on our courses, we have speech level singing people on our courses. And, you know, we can make an interface. We don't have to use a special language. Okay. I'm going to talk about stiff folds, and then I'll probably do a little skip. Ooh. No, right. What do we mean by stiff folds? Because the Estill model proposes thick, thin, and stiff. When we stiffen a muscle, it's the result of contracting those muscle fibers against resistance. Similar to a bodybuilder showing off their biceps. I'm sorry, I don't think I can do it. But if you lay your arm down on a table and keep it steady, you will be able to contract that muscle. Actually, where you're sitting now, if you don't move anything and you tighten one of your buttocks, you're stiffening that muscle. Okay, now the gluteus maximus isn't quite like the vocalis because it is attached to other muscles, but it gives you an idea. You didn't move anything else, but you know what? You can really, that's stiffening a muscle. In falsetto, the vocalis muscle is anything but stiffened in this way. And this is across the research literature. The vocalis muscle is lax. The vocal folds are actually looser. Lax means relaxed. What's more, it's not active in vibration. Only the outer layers, the ligament and the mucosa layer, are active, and they can touch. We know that in falsetto, the vocal folds can be in contact. We hear it all the time in countertenor singing, and you hear it in good classical singers, female classical singers, who use a falsetto setup. So the action isn't in the stiffness of the fold, it's actually to do with the TA letting go of its contraction. There's also the idea that we have a raised vocal fold plane in Estill, which is that the plane of the vocal folds moves up as the muscles that open the vocal folds engage. Now, this doesn't really make a lot of sense, because when the muscles of the vocal folds at the back engage, the posterior cricoaretino, that is the breathing gesture. And, you know, on reflection, I'm at a loss to know how the breathing gesture can actually be used efficiently in phonation. And again, this idea came from the fact that the aretinoids seemed to, from, you know, viewing that the aretinoids seemed to move back. Well, they only move back because the muscle that's been contracting has stopped contracting. You're not using PCA to lift the back of the vocal folds up. I could have talked for a lot longer, couldn't I? Okay.